Hello, and welcome to the second video in my ACT English Punctuation Guide. In the first one, we covered the two fundamentals, that being clause types and interrupters. If you haven't seen that yet, I highly recommend you go back and just review it. If you aren't comfortable with clause types or interrupters, you really need to know that because that's going to determine almost all of the rules in this video. This one is going to cover the actual rules of each individual punctuation mark that you're going to see in the ACT. Just keep in mind, as I said before with my videos, the whole idea is to move quickly, just show you what you need to know, maybe a quick example, and move on. If you're not quite sure that you understood something, I highly recommend you go look up more detailed examples or articles, or you can always just rewatch the video. If you'd like me to make a more in-depth guide on any particular punctuation mark, let me know and I can do that. But the idea here is if you already pretty much know these things, it's just a quick reminder and it'll teach you maybe the little bits you didn't know. And if it's something you didn't know, it'll help you figure out this is something I need to learn, and I'll highlight what you actually need to know for the ACT about it. So for these rules, I'd highly recommend to make flashcards for each of these punctuation marks because this is the bulk of the ACT English. Once you know these, you're going to know how to do maybe 50–60% of the English questions. In fact, after you finish this video and you know these rules, I'd even recommend you start practicing actual ACT tests. You can find practice tests from their website or online, or you can even get books with practice tests. You don't necessarily need to know all of the things to start getting practice. Once you have enough to start feeling comfortable, you can kind of fill in between practice ones and my future videos on the actual other concepts as you go. So let's get into it. We're going to go in order this time of the simplest to the hardest, rather than the most important to the least important. Because in this case, you really kind of have to understand all of them to be able to choose between the different punctuation marks, and that's what the ACT is going to have you do. The way they're going to be structured is you're going to have an essay, and certain bits of sentences are going to be underlined. Those underlined bits are what you're going to be able to change between the answer choices. But you're still going to have to read all the parts outside of the underlined section to decide what's going on and what I need to do. So let's start here with semicolons and periods because they are the simplest. I'll say right off the bat, almost none of my students ever know how to use a semicolon. And that's fine because they're extremely rare. The good news for the ACT, it's the same thing as a period. No difference between a semicolon and a period. You don't need to know about technically when should I use one or the other. The ACT is not going to test that. It doesn't matter. So what do? They separate two independent clauses, which if you don't remember, an independent clause has a subject, a verb, and makes sense on its own as a complete idea. So what else we have to know? That's it. That's the ACT semicolon and periods. So if you ever see a period or a semicolon as an option in your answer choice, make sure, check your clause types on both sides. If either one is not an independent clause, then that answer is wrong. You can eliminate it and move on to the other answers. If they're both independent, then that's the right answer. And again, just your little trick, if you ever have two of the exact same answer, where the only difference is one has a semicolon, the other has the period, nothing else changes, they're both wrong because they're the same answer. So let's give a quick example or two. So here's a correct example. Alexander didn't study for the test. He didn't do very well. Both sides of this semicolon here has an independent clause, meaning if I read it by itself, it's going to make sense. Alexander didn't study for the test. Subject, verb, makes sense as a complete idea. On the other side, he didn't do very well. That also makes sense on its own. It's a subject and a verb, and it's a complete sentence. Here we have a semicolon. Here it is again with a period. They're both correct. As I said, the ACT will never make you choose between this one or that one. If they try to, they're both wrong. So let's give an example of what you can't do. Alexander didn't study for the test, the hardest test of the year. In this case, I went ahead and put the problem part in red. This is a dependent clause, not independent. The hardest test of the year does not have a verb. It's not a complete idea on its own, so I cannot put a semicolon in between these two clauses. What you're going to find is you need a comma. not a semicolon or a period. So now let's move on to dashes and parentheses. If you did watch my first video like I recommended, you already know these are used for interrupters. And that's it. They're not used for anything else. Just keep in mind that commas can also be used for interrupters, so it's not just these. But if you ever see one of these, you know you have an interrupter because there's nothing else they can be used for. Your job then is just to make sure that it really is an interrupter. So test it, try taking out the interrupter if you think it's what it is, and if you can, and the sentence still makes sense, then use one of these guys. Doesn't make you choose between dashes, parentheses, or even commas. If they're truly interrupters, just like between the periods and the semicolons, there's no way to choose between them. If you have to, they're both wrong because you probably don't actually have an interrupter here. Another thing to keep in mind, because the ACT loves to do this, where they're going to put one dash in your sentence, not in the underlined part, which is what you're trying to change. It's going to be earlier on, usually, or it might be later. So you have to be paying attention and notice there's a dash. And since you know dashes are only used for interrupters, if it's in the middle of the sentence, most likely you're going to have to put the second dash in there to finish the other side of the interrupter. So be ready to put that in. There's one exception, and that's if the interrupter is at the end of the sentence. In that case, there's going to be the dash, then the interrupter, then a period. I did want to put a quick warning in here. Don't worry too much about this because you're almost never going to see a hyphen in the ACT. I've seen it maybe 2-3 times, but I did want to put this in just in case you do because dashes and hyphens look the same. Hyphens, here's an example here, are used to combine two words to make an adjective. So here we have an age-old question, where age and old are combined with a hyphen to make an adjective to say you just have a really old question. If you see something like this, that's not actually an interrupter, that's a hyphen used for something else. As I said though, don't worry too much about those. They're extremely rare, but since they can be confusing, I just wanted to put that on the slide. Let's get some examples in here. And again, these are going to look familiar if you already saw my other video. So right off the bat, I chose to write a paper about genetics, my favorite biology subject. As with before, anytime you see an interrupter, you want to test to make sure it really is an interrupter. In this case, it's at the end of the sentence, so let's take it out and see if the rest of the sentence still makes sense without it. I chose to write a paper about genetics. That's a complete sentence, makes sense on its own, therefore we have an interrupter at the end, meaning one dash and then a period. It's pretty rare, but it does happen. That's why I wanted to put it up front, as a reminder you can do it at the end. Here's another example with it in the middle of a sentence. Thor, the biggest dog I've ever seen, loves to cuddle with the kittens. Anytime you see an interrupter, and again, don't just assume it's an interrupter, because the ACT is going to have things where it's written incorrectly, and it's your job to realize that and to fix it. So let's test and see, is it an interrupter? Let's take it out of the sentence. Thor loves to cuddle with the kitten. That's a complete sentence. It makes sense. Therefore, this is in fact an interrupter. It's got dashes on both sides. What you might see on the ACT is Thor dash the biggest dog, and then all of a sudden it starts an underline on this part. And you have to realize I need to put a dash right here to finish that interrupter. Now let's write these two again with parentheses. It's the exact same sentence, but notice here I'm using parentheses instead of dashes. These are exactly the same as before. Neither one is more correct than the other. Just keep in mind, if it's at the end of the sentence, with parentheses, you still need to close the parentheses, whereas with dashes, you're just going to have the one. Next, we're going to go and get a little bit more complicated with colons. Another one that people think they know how to use, but they've only ever really seen it used one way, and they really don't know the little specifics, which maybe you do, maybe you don't. Let's go into it. Starting off, there's two rules that you're going to have to know. First, there has to be an independent clause before the colon. So to the left of the colon must be a complete sentence. If it's not a complete sentence, it's not correct. There are some very, very rare exceptions to that, but I'm not going to get into it because it's almost never going to be on the ACT. So, in other words, you should be able to end the sentence at that colon, and it should make perfect sense. So you could just replace that colon with the period, ignore the stuff after it, and it should be okay. If you can't do that, you don't want to use a colon. It doesn't matter what comes after that colon. That can be independent or dependent. All that matters is before has to be independent. So the next rule you need to know is, well, what do I put that after that colon? When should I use it? Well, it needs to be a list, an explanation, a definition, or an example. In the next few slides, I'm going to go into an example of each of these and how you're supposed to do that. Now, ACT loves to put these trick answers in there because people think like, oh, it's used for an example, it's used for a list. Therefore, for example, such as or including, those must be good uses of a colon. But if you ever have one of these, you're breaking a rule 1 because you won't have an independent clause that makes sense before the colon. So never put a colon with those. Let's give an example of what I was just talking about there. So I will go to the store to pick up 3 items: tomatoes, lettuce, and carrots. Notice, before that colon, I will go to the store to pick up 3 items. That's a complete sentence. Makes sense on its own, so I'm okay to use this colon. And you'll notice in this case, it's a list that I'm using. So, like I just said, you always want to test if the stuff to the left of the colon is a complete sentence, which we just did. It is, so we're okay. I will go to the store to pick up 3 items. We're allowed to do that. It's a complete sentence. Rule 1's obeyed. What you can't do is I will go to the store to pick up 3 items, including, tomatoes, lettuce, and carrots. This is an answer you're almost always going to see on the ACT, and it is wrong. Why? Well, test it. Is the stuff to the left a whole sentence? You would just have, I will go to the store to pick up 3 items, including. That's not a complete idea. That word including messes it up. Therefore, this is wrong. You can't do it. Breaks rule 1. Don't use the colon. In fact, the correct way to do this, if you wanted the word including, is to just remove it. So it would just be including tomatoes, lettuce, and carrots. Okay, so let's go into all of those use cases, starting with the list. Just saw an example, but let's see another one. John's class schedule includes 5 classes: algebra, biology, history, English, and Spanish. Again, to the left, is it an independent clause? John's class schedule includes 5 classes. Yes, it is. Therefore, we're okay. To the right is a list of what are those 5 classes. It's a complete list. And again, like we just did, always test to the left to see if we have that complete sentence. John's class schedule includes 5 classes. You get real tired of me always putting this there, but it's to really reiterate how important that is, because that's what they're going to do to test you on the ACT. So this is a complete sentence. Rule 1 is obeyed. We're okay. This is a list, which is what one of the uses of a colon is. So we're okay to use a colon. We're good to go. Now let's move on to using it for explanations. This is where people usually haven't seen columns or colons. They've usually used them for lists, and that's about it. So here's something new: explanation. The baking judge was amazed. He had never tasted such an amazing cupcake. So in this case, the part after that colon is explaining, so it's an explanation. Why was he amazed? Well, it's because he had never tasted such a great cupcake before. And if you haven't caught on to what I'm going to do next, here it is. Always check rule 1. Is the part to the left a whole sentence? The baking judge was amazed. Yes, it is. That's a complete sentence. Rule 1 is okay. The colon is okay because it's a list, an explanation. Well, in this case, it's an explanation. Or it could also be an example or a definition. So let's get to the definition. The blacksmith began designing a boarding axe, a weapon commonly wielded by pirates in history. In this case, the part after the colon telling us what that boarding axe is. It's a weapon commonly wielded by pirates in history. Keep in mind, this doesn't need to be some formal dictionary definition. It can just be an informal explanation of what is that thing. And surprise, surprise, we're going to do the rule 1 check. Is this a complete sentence to the left? The blacksmith began designing a boarding axe. Yes, it is. So we're okay. 1 is obeyed. Finally, let's see it used as an example. Hannah has always been amazing at sports. She was the MVP of her volleyball team last season. In this case, this is giving an example of her being amazing at sports. And that's the final use of colons. One check, as we always do. Let's see if the stuff to the left of the colon is a complete sentence. Hannah has always been amazing at sports. Yes, it is. It has a subject, a verb, makes sense on its own. Rule 1's obeyed. That's it. That's colons. Moving on now to the big one, commas. Take your time here, rewatch the video section a couple times if you need to, make your flashcards, look up examples if you need. There are a lot of uses for commas, and it can get confusing, and you really have to understand them. So take your time, don't get too frustrated. Let's get into it. That's what's going to be tested more than all the other ones, but you need to know the others to know that you're not using them if you're using a comma. As I just said, it's used for several things, and this time I'm just going to go in order of most important to least important. In fact, we already covered one, the big one, interrupters. Just like dashes, just like parentheses, it can be used for an interrupter. No difference between those, use them exactly the same way. If you don't remember that, go watch either my first video on interrupters or earlier in this video where I was talking about the parentheses and the dashes. Now, what is the most important use of commas that's going to be tested most frequently? It's going to be separating an independent clause from a dependent clause. So if you remember, the periods and semicolons were used to separate two independent clauses. Well, if you have one independent and one dependent, that's where you use a comma. Just so you know, you can never have just dependent clauses. Then you have an independent, or you have an incomplete sentence. You have to always have at least one independent clause. It doesn't matter which one's first. You can have the independent or the dependent first, but if you have one and then the other, you're using a comma. In the ACT, you're very frequently going to have to choose between the comma, a period, a semicolon, or nothing. Sometimes you might have a dash, sometimes you might have a parenthesis, sometimes you might have a colon. Those are less common. This is the big one, where they're going to make you choose between these. The way to do it is to check your clause types on either side. If you have two dependents, it's wrong. You're not going to want anything because you're just going to make an incomplete sentence. If you have an independent and a dependent, you want a comma. If you have two independent clauses, you want a period or a semicolon. So let's give some examples. Alexander didn't study for the test, the hardest test of the year. We had this before, but this time we're doing it correctly and using a comma instead of a semicolon here because this part's independent. Alexander didn't study for the test. We have a subject, a verb, and a complete idea. But over here, the hardest test of the year, subject, but no verb, and it's not a complete idea. So we have an independent and a dependent, we use a comma. Here's another one. While out shopping, Cat stopped to pet a stray cat. Here we have the black independent clause on the back end and the red dependent clause first. It doesn't really matter. As long as you have one and then the other, we're going to use a comma. So let's go now to the second use of commas, and that's fanboys. Not the literal definition of fanboys, but the acronym meaning for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. These are very important key words that are unfortunately going to break the rule that I just taught you. What they're used to do is actually take an independent clause and make it dependent. So if you have a fanboy right after a comma, it's actually going to take what would be two independent clauses and connect them with a comma followed by a fanboy immediately. And we'll get some examples of that. Just keep in mind that these fanboy words can be used for other things. Only put that comma in front of one if there are two independent clauses on either side of that fanboy and a comma. If they're not, you don't need that comma because it's actually being used for something else. So here's an example. Hubert brought food to the picnic and Sheila brought drinks. So if we didn't have that and there, which is a fanboy, that's the A, I would have two independent clauses. Hubert brought food to the picnic. That's a complete sentence. Sheila brought drinks. That's a complete sentence. So if I just wanted to connect those two, I would normally put a period or a semicolon. But since I have a fanboy, I have to use a comma. Here's another one. I should have aced that test, but I forgot to study. Again, I I should have aced that test is an independent clause. I forgot to study is an independent clause. I would normally connect that with a period or a semicolon, but in this case we have a fanboy here. But, which is that B. Now, as I said, they can be used for other things, so I wanted to give you one quick example of that. This is especially true with and or. Same with for. So, Don gave the cat his food and poured his water. So, and, that's on our list, that's the A, but keep in mind, fanboys with a comma, that's only if I have two independent clauses. So here, Don gave the cat his food, that is independent, but on the other side, poured his water. That is dependent. So I should not use a comma at all. The and is actually just being used to list two different things that he did. In this case, you're going to have no comma at all. Because if you did, you would have an incorrect sentence. So, now on to the third use, transition words. Here are some examples of transition words. There's several of them. However, instead, therefore, additionally. You're going to want to be familiar with recognizing these, being able to know when to use them, but that doesn't really matter for punctuation. You just have to know that it is a transition word. And they're going to show up in one of two places, either the beginning of the sentence or the middle. Let's go in order. If the transition word starts the sentence, you're going to put a comma right after that transition word. For example, however, no one was listening. However is one of our transition words. So it starts the sentence, I just put a comma right there, and then continue my sentence. That's all there is to it. If we put it in the middle of a sentence, it can be a little bit more complicated, but not too much. There, you're going to need to put punctuation on both sides of the transition word. Just make sure to check your clauses on either side of that transition word to see what punctuation we want. If we have at least one side being dependent, then you're going to want to use two commas. In essence, you have an interrupter there. If both sides are independent, then you're actually going to want to make sure that one of those is a comma and the other one is either a period or semicolon. Why did I put that in comma uses? Because the ACT might make you choose that, or they might present it to you as having those two commas, and it's your job to realize, take them out. I don't actually have an interrupter like it was presenting. I have two independent clauses, so I need to make sure I separate that with a period or semicolon. So let's give a few examples of that middle of the sentence I was talking about, since that's the more complicated. The coach, therefore, was not impressed. So, therefore is my transition word. So let's check what's on either side to see our clause types. You're going to see me check clause types a lot. That's the primary thing in the ACT. So to the left, the coach. That's not an independent clause. It's dependent. It's just a subject. On the right hand, was not impressed. Also dependent. So in this case, we do not have two independent clauses. We have dependent, dependent. We're going to want to put a comma on both sides. So it should be written like this. The coach, therefore, comma, comma, was not impressed. Notice that in essence is just making it an interrupter, because we could take it out and just have the coach was not impressed, and that's okay. That's what's going on here. So let's give another example, this time with the two independents where things are not going to work with two commas. So here, however, is my transition word. The meal was supposed to start at noon. That's an independent clause to the left. On the right-hand side, the turkey wasn't done cooking until 1 o'clock. That's also a complete idea, an independent clause. So if you're moving too quickly, you're going to see, oh, transition word in the middle of this sentence. Put two commas there, but that's wrong. Since we have two independent clauses, you're actually going to need to put a period or a semicolon on one side. So here's how you could write it. The meal was supposed to start at noon, period. However, the turkey wasn't done cooking until 1 o'clock. In reality, what's happening here, that transition word should have been either at the end or beginning of a sentence. And it's really that first case example. Then you just want that one comma after the transition word. On a similar note, we have phrases. So these are still transitions that are just more than one word. And I also decided I wanted to throw prepositional phrases in here because they follow the same rule. So What are these rules? If you have a transitional phrase or prepositional phrase at the beginning of a sentence, you're going to need to put a comma after that phrase. And if you're sitting here wondering, well, what is a prepositional phrase? These are words that indicate where something is relative to something else. The key to remembering that is right there in the word position. So it tells you the position of something relative to something else. Something like above, under, around. So if you have a phrase beginning with a preposition, or it's a transitioning phrase, just put a comma after that. So let's look at two quick examples of that, starting with a prepositional phrase. Under the desk, I found my backpack. Under the desk is telling us where the backpack is relative to the desk. So I need to have a comma after that prepositional phrase. And now an example of a transitioning phrase. As a result, I aced my test. So this is going to indicate causation, transitioning from something ahead or something previously to why I aced my test. So put the comma after that. Now let's go to a fourth use. Not quite the last, there's one more, but this is an easy one for commas. Lists, also known as the Oxford comma. So you are always going to put commas between every item in a list if there's three or more. If there's only two, you don't need commas. Just keep in mind, you're just going to always put that comma before the last item because some programs are going to teach that as optional. That's the Oxford comma part I was talking about. On the ACT, it's not optional. You need to have it or else your answer is wrong. So, for an example, Josiah's hobbies include running, cooking, and yoga. This is a list of his three or more hobbies. So I have a comma in between each, and I always have this comma before the last one. Do not remove the comma like this. Some places might say that's okay, and grammatically it might be acceptable, but not on the ACT. Now for the last use, modifying clauses and coordinate adjectives. Here's the good news. We're not going to go into that right now. These are more advanced, and they're not that frequently tested on the ACT. I will cover that in another video for advanced English concepts, but that's not important right now. You should only go to those after you're getting more comfortable with the English section and you're trying to get the more niche questions to really push to those higher scores. But that might not be entirely necessary, and you can still do very well without getting to these. So we're going to move on from that, and you're done with the commas. As I said, you'll get to those once you're comfortable with the other things and you've had your practice with English. You might have even moved on to non-English sections. Come back once you're just trying to push that score up, those last few steps. So I wanted to finish this with how do I actually handle the punctuation questions on the ACT? Because you want to follow a specific order because there's a lot of things going on. So if you just follow the same order of steps, you're never going to forget anything and you're going to catch whatever they're trying to do. So the first thing you want to do, read the entire sentence and find all punctuation marks. I put entire in bold here because that means the whole thing, not just the underlined part that you might be changing. And we're going to find every punctuation mark. Figure out what they're doing. Look first for those less common ones, the dashes, the parentheses, the colons. You don't see them a lot. They're only used for a few little things. So also look through your answer choices to see if you find any of those. You can test them first because they're not used for much and it's really easy to figure out, do they make sense here or do they not? If they do, you might be done. If they don't, you can get rid of those answer choices right off the bat. Once you're past those, you're going to determine the purpose of every punctuation mark. So at that point, it's mostly commas, periods, semicolons, outside of your underlined section. So not the stuff you can change, because those you'd have to test a whole bunch of things. Start with all the rest of the sentence and figure out what are they used for. Primarily what you're going to be looking for here are interrupters. If you see that dash elsewhere, you probably have to put the second dash in your underlined section, and you need to notice that. If you see a comma beforehand, you have to figure out, is that comma starting an interrupter? Is that comma part of a list? Is that comma separating an independent and dependent clause? So I need to make sure I have that. That's what you're trying to figure out. So if you think it's starting to make an interrupter, if you don't know, see if any of your answers would finish that interrupter. If it is an interrupter, good, you can take it out, but don't just assume it is. If you see it, remove it whenever you read it. If there's an interrupter before you even get to your underlined section, just from now on, read the sentence without it. Pretend that's not there. If you have an incomplete interrupter, there's going to be a comma with no other purpose. It's not being used for anything else. You're going to have to realize that and put the second comma in to your answer to finish that interrupter. So once you have those two things figured out, you might be done, but if not, we'll keep going. Check your clause types. Look out for those fanboys, because again, you're trying to figure out, do I have an independent and a dependent? If so, comma. Do I have two independents? Semicolon or period. But if you have two independents and a fanboy in between, need the comma there. Just keep in mind. Be careful not to make a run-on sentence. That's when you have two independent clauses with no punctuation. They might make it where it's not like that and you accidentally make it that way, or they might give it to you that way and you have to realize there needs to be punctuation there. Also, don't just make a bunch of dependent clauses. You have to always have at least one independent clause. Once you've checked your clause types, then you can pick your answer. If you've done all those three things, you should be able to figure out which one works based on the any interrupters, what are all the other punctuation marks doing, any of the rare punctuation, and then what clause types do we have. That's all you need to be able to answer these. After you've chosen your answer, don't stop. Check those clause types again, which might sound stupid and unnecessary, especially with a time limit, but there's a reason. Because your answer choices don't just choose a punctuation mark. Sometimes it's actually going to add words or take words out of the sentence. And when you do that, you might take what looked like it was originally an independent clause and made it dependent. So where you thought you had independent, and chose a semicolon, a word actually took out the subject in your answer. And now you have an independent and a dependent, so you can't use that semicolon. So once you have your answer, check the clause type again and just make sure that it didn't change the words and change the clause types from what you thought you just had. And finally, read that whole sentence again one more time with what you think is your answer and just make sure it sounds okay and you didn't miss something silly. And that's it. That's your punctuation question. So I'm going to put that all together in one slide here because I know that was a lot. Here are the 6 steps on how you want to approach those punctuation questions. Read the whole sentence, find all the punctuation marks. Figure out what all of them are doing, starting outside of your underlined section, then you can look in your underlined section. Then you want to check your clause types because that's going to determine which one of these punctuation marks can I use. Pick your answer based on those 3 things you just did. Once you have your answer, check your clause types again, make sure nothing changed, and then plug it in and reread the whole sentence just to make sure it sounds okay. That's it. That's all the core punctuation. At this point, you should be able, once you master these, to actually start doing some ACT English practice sections. Don't worry too much about the fact that there's going to be things you haven't learned yet in my videos. Start practicing, and then you can come back and watch some of the next videos and kind of do that back and forth. It's really important to get practice with actual ACT English sections. Once you've got that, move on to my next videos covering the other concepts. And good luck, as always.